There are secrets that survive fires. Secrets that last long after the people who buried them are gone, after the houses built on top of them have crumbled, and after the families who swore generation after generation that they would never surface have scattered to the wind. And then there are the other kinds of secrets, not the ones locked in drawers or hidden in sealed letters, but the ones written in the quiet, methodical handwriting of a woman no one ever thought to pay much attention to. She wasn't a lawyer. She never held an official title of any kind. She was never called to testify before a judge, never given a seat at any table where important decisions were made. She was just the woman who showed up when a child was about to be born into this world. And she always arrived with her bag, her steady, capable hands, and a small leather notebook she kept hidden from everyone. For almost 30 years, she wrote down everything. Not because anyone asked her to, and not because anyone told her it mattered. She did it because she understood something back then that the powerful men all around her refused to accept. She understood that the real truth about a person, who they truly are and where they actually come from, gets written in the very first moment of their life. Before all the lies can begin. Before the names get chosen for public consumption. Before the family gets to decide which version of events the world is allowed to see. She wrote all of it down. And when she passed away quietly in that small room at the back of the big house she had served for 30 years, those notes did not disappear with her. What happened after those notebooks were discovered shook one of the most powerful families in the entire state of Virginia all the way down to its very foundation. It made people question the legitimacy of fortunes, of marriages, of inheritances, and of reputations that had taken generations to build. It exposed a kind of truth that powerful men don't just wish would go away. They need it to be suppressed. Because without that suppression, everything they have built just dissolves into nothing. This right here is the story of Harriet Voss, midwife, keeper of records, and the most dangerous woman in Albemarle County, even though no one knew it until after she was already gone. You're going to want to stay with us for this one. So this takes us to Albemarle County, Virginia, in the autumn of 1841. October in the Blue Ridge Mountains has this particular quality of light, kind of amber and pale all at once, like the sun is already getting ready to leave the valley behind for another winter. The roads out there would turn to thick mud after the first rains hit. And the farm hands working the outer edges of the big estates learned pretty fast that certain sounds travel much farther in that cold air. The crack of wagon wheels hitting frozen ruts, a dog barking and another one answering from half a mile away, and this particular rhythm of a woman walking fast, carrying a leather bag. That rhythm meant someone somewhere was about to be born. Harriet Voss was 41 years old the very first time she came to work for the Langford family. She wasn't born in Albemarle County. She had come from a small settlement up north of Charlottesville, where an older woman named Agnes taught her the trade. Agnes was a midwife who had trained under a real physician, and she truly believed that the difference between a baby living and a baby dying usually came down to just a few things: cleanliness, patience, and absolutely refusing to panic. Agnes passed all that knowledge and all those habits on to Harriet with the same seriousness a master craftsman uses when handing down tools to an apprentice. Harriet wasn't a big woman. She was compact and deliberate in the way she moved, with hands that were always a little roughed up from all the washing she did. She was incredibly meticulous about that, way more than most people were back then. And her face, people would describe it years later, after she was gone, when anyone actually bothered to remember her, they would say she looked watchful. Not unkind, not cold, just watchful. Like she was always paying attention to something just beyond what everyone else could see. She had been married once, very briefly, to a man named Carl Voss who worked at a tannery north of the county. He died of a fever back in 1827, leaving Harriet with no children, a small inheritance of tools and linens, and that last name she kept because it was hers now and she just didn't see any reason to give it up. She had no family in the area at all. What she had instead was a reputation. Back in that county, where childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for women no matter their social standing, a skilled midwife wasn't some luxury item. She was an absolute necessity. The physicians over in Charlottesville were few and far between, expensive, and usually not available when labor started at 2 in the morning during a winter storm. But Harriet Voss, she was always available. She would ask for a modest fee from families who could manage it, and she charged nothing from the ones who couldn't. She didn't treat the wife of a big plantation owner any different from the wife of a tenant farmer, at least not in that delivery room. Outside that room, she understood perfectly well how the world was arranged. But inside, when a woman was literally fighting for her life and the life of the child she was carrying, Harriet was just the person who actually knew what to do. By the time the Langford family finally called for her, she had been practicing for almost 15 years and had been present for more than 200 births. The Langfords were exactly the kind of family that Albemarle County had basically been built around, or at least that's what they believed, and the county mostly just let them go on believing it. Their original land grant went all the way back to the early colonial period, and one generation after another had just kept expanding the property through purchases, through marriages, and through all that careful maneuvering that people like to call luck when it's really just strategy. By 1841, the Langford estate, they called it Westmere, covered almost 4,000 acres of mixed farmland, timber, and tobacco fields. All of it was worked by enslaved people, the number of them fluctuating between 60 and 90 depending on the season and how much work the harvest demanded. Edmund Langford was the patriarch, a man of 58 when Harriet first came to Westmere. His wife Adelaide had given him 3 surviving children, 2 sons named Charles and Thomas, and a daughter named Lydia, before her health got too fragile for any more pregnancies. Edmund accepted that situation with all the public dignity you would expect from a Virginia gentleman, and in private, he made the kind of arrangements that were common enough back then in that plantation world, even though nobody ever talked about them in polite company. Harriet came to Westmere that autumn because Adelaide Langford had gone through a really frightening episode during what was supposed to be a routine exam by the family doctor, a man named Dr. Harlan Pute. And Pute had quietly suggested to Edmund that it would be a smart move to have a resident midwife on hand, someone who could look after Mrs. Langford's health and also attend to the needs of all the women in the household more broadly. Edmund agreed. He sent word out through all those networks that connected wealthy families with skilled domestic workers. And within 2 weeks, Harriet Voss showed up at Westmere carrying her bag and her notebook and that watchful expression, and she would not leave that place for 27 years. The notebook itself wasn't anything special to look at. It was just a standard ledger book, the kind you could buy at any dry goods store back then. Dark brown leather cover, sewn binding, cream-colored pages that were moderately thick. Harriet went through several of them over the years. Each one would fill up as time passed and then get replaced by a new one, while the old ones went into the tin-lined box she kept hidden under her narrow bed in that tiny room off the kitchen that was her private space. She had started keeping notebooks long before she ever came to Westmere. Her teacher Agnes had kept records too, nothing too detailed, just entries with the date, the mother's name, and how things turned out. Agnes once told her that a midwife who didn't keep records was a midwife who couldn't learn from her own mistakes. It was practical advice, and Harriet followed it. But as time went on, Harriet's records turned into something way more than just practical notes. She recorded the date and time of every single birth, the mother's name, the name they gave the child's physical characteristics, estimated weight from feeling them, coloring, any noticeable features. She wrote down the names of anyone else who was in the room. She wrote down the father's name exactly as the mother gave it to her. And this right here, in the complicated world of Westmere, was where her notebook started holding information that nobody else had ever written down anywhere. Because on a plantation like that one, not all births were considered equal in the eyes of the law or in the official family records. The births of enslaved children got recorded, when they got recorded at all, in estate ledgers, as property inventories. The births of white children to white women got written down in family Bibles and eventually in county registers. But the births that fell into the spaces between those two categories, the children born from relationships that the law simply did not recognize and the family absolutely refused to acknowledge, those births got recorded nowhere except in Harriet's notebook. She didn't set out to be some kind of revolutionary. She wasn't a woman with political opinions, at least not in any way she ever expressed openly. She was a professional, and she was thorough, and she was the type of person who just could not leave a fact unrecorded simply because writing it down might be inconvenient for someone else. She wrote down what she saw. She wrote down what those mothers told her. And she never, ever showed those notebooks to anyone. Not for 27 years. So, November 1841. The very first birth Harriet attended at Westmere wasn't complicated from a medical standpoint. The mother was a young enslaved woman named Nora, maybe 19 or 20 years old. Nobody knew for sure because her own birth had never been recorded. She had been working in the Langford house as a kitchen helper for about 3 years. Nora was small and absolutely terrified, and nobody had told her hardly anything about what was coming. The older women in the enslaved quarters had tried to prepare her a little, but the plantation was so isolated, and there had been some disruptions in previous years, 2 deaths among the older enslaved women who might have otherwise guided her, so Nora went into her labor with the kind of ignorance that made a midwife's calm authority both practically necessary and deeply meaningful. Harriet spent 7 hours with Nora. The baby came just before midnight, healthy, a little boy. And Nora cried in a way that seemed to hold both relief and something else that Harriet recognized as grief. It was the grief of a woman who understood perfectly well what her child's life was going to be like. Once the immediate crisis was over and Nora was resting, Harriet took out her notebook by the light of that single candle they had given her and she wrote the entry. November 14, 1841. Mother, Nora. Child, male, healthy, weight estimated at 7 pounds. No given name yet. Father, name withheld by mother at first inquiry. On second inquiry after assurances of my discretion, mother stated, E.L. She paused right there after writing those initials. Then she kept going. Mother expressed fear. I administered reassurance. Child delivered without complication. Both mother and child in good condition at time of my departure. She closed the notebook and put it back in her bag. E.L. Edmund Langford. It wasn't exactly a surprise. A woman who moved through the world of those big plantation households learned pretty fast how to read the currents running underneath the surface. Who deferred to who avoided whose eyes, who got treated a little differently by the master without anyone ever acknowledging the reason. Harriet had only been at Westmere for about 6 weeks before Nora's delivery, but she had already noticed the way Edmund Langford's gaze would shift when he passed through the kitchen, and the way Nora would tense up when he was nearby, and the way the older enslaved women kept their faces so carefully neutral whenever his name came up in certain conversations. She wasn't shocked. She was just careful. Those initials E.L. would show up in her notebooks 3 more times over the next 11 years. Twice next to the names of other enslaved women at Westmere. Once next to the name of a young woman who worked over in the county town and whose connection to the Langford household was less direct, but it wasn't absent either. Those particular entries were among the ones that years later would matter the most. But back in November of 1841, Harriet was simply doing her job, writing in her notebook, and starting the long process of making herself invisible. In its own way, that was a deliberate strategy, not some big conspiracy. Harriet wasn't a strategist in any political sense, but she had a practiced skill. She had learned pretty early in her career that a midwife who could make herself both indispensable and unobtrusive was a midwife who got allowed into all the rooms and conversations and private moments that other outsiders never got to see. She didn't seek out that access for any sinister purpose. She wanted it because it let her do her work better. But over time, the access just kept accumulating, and the notebooks kept filling up, and the information inside them grew into something whose weight Harriet herself might not have fully understood until much later. She took care of Adelaide Langford's ongoing health needs through that autumn and into the winter. She got into a routine at Westmere, waking up early, getting her medical supplies and herbal preparations ready. Those were the practical core of her practice, attending to whatever calls came from either the big house or the quarters, and always maintaining the cleanliness standards that Agnes had drilled into her head. She ate her meals in the kitchen, slept in that tiny room, and spoke politely to everyone, but briefly to most people. By all accounts, she was extremely good at her job. Adelaide Langford made it through the winter and regained enough strength by spring that even Dr. Pute expressed genuine satisfaction. The enslaved women out in the quarters who had always been terrified of childbirth found that having Harriet around changed the experience in ways they never expected. It didn't make it completely safe, because nothing about birth in that time and place was truly safe, but they were attended to with a level of care and skill that made the difference between life and death happen more often than just pure chance would have predicted. Edmund Langford paid her wages without any complaint. He was, Harriet noted in a brief personal observation she tucked between entries in her second notebook, a man who valued effectiveness above almost everything else, and who was perceptive enough to recognize it when he saw it. He didn't talk to her very often. She wasn't the kind of employee you would bother having a conversation with. But when he did speak to her, there was this quality of assessment in his attention that told her he understood exactly how useful she really was. She understood something about him too. But she wrote it in the notebook and kept it locked away in that box under her bed. Charles Langford was 22 in 1845 and already looked like his father in ways that went beyond just the physical. He had that same deliberate way of moving through a room, that same habit of pausing before he spoke, that same quality of attention that felt like you were being measured rather than just looked at. He got educated partly at home and partly at a small college in Richmond, and he came back to Westmere with that easy confidence you see in men who have been told since childhood that the whole world around them exists in some fundamental way for their benefit. He got married in the spring of 1845. His wife was Ellen Holt, the daughter of a moderately prosperous family from a neighboring county. She was a slender woman with very careful manners and an expression that Harriet, meeting her for the first time at the wedding, immediately classified as both composed and watchful. Not in the same way Harriet herself was watchful, though. Harriet watched things to gather information. Ellen, she sensed almost immediately, watched things looking for danger. Their first child came in early 1847. A boy, delivered cleanly with no crisis on a cold January night while Charles Langford paced the hallway right outside the door. Harriet wrote the entry. Mother, Ellen Langford, born Holt. Child, male, healthy. Name given, Edmund Holt Langford, in honor of the grandfather. Father, Charles Langford, husband. Delivery without complication. Both mother and child in good condition. She paused like she always did to consider if there was anything else worth noting. There wasn't in this case. Everything about this birth was exactly what it seemed to be. The second child came in 1849. A girl they named Catherine, also completely straightforward. Ellen Langford wasn't an easy patient. She was proud and controlled in a way that made accepting help from another woman difficult for her. But she was physically strong, and the births went well. Charles's younger brother Thomas was a completely different kind of man. Where Charles was measured, Thomas was volatile, not in a violent way exactly, but with a restlessness that showed up as sudden enthusiasms and then sudden disappointments, schemes that would bloom brilliantly for about 6 months and then just die because he couldn't sustain the attention. He had gone out west for a while, came back, tried to start his own separate venture on the edge of the Langford property, and eventually just settled into this role of nominal management that satisfied absolutely nobody, least of all himself. Thomas was also, Harriet noted privately, a man who drank way more than was good for him, and who, in the years after coming back from out west, spent long stretches of time at a boarding house in Charlottesville under circumstances that the Langford family would only discuss using that elliptical language polite Virginians used for things they couldn't just name directly. In 1851, Thomas married a woman named Vivian Carr, a widow 7 years older than him who already had children of her own from her first marriage. The Langford family didn't exactly approve. Edmund Sr. had wanted a match that would bring either land or money to the estate, and Vivian Carr brought neither. But Thomas, in one of those rare moments where he actually showed some determined persistence, refused to be talked out of it. And Edmund, who was by then in his late 60s and getting tired, just gave in. Vivian Langford was interesting to Harriet in ways she didn't even fully articulate in her notebooks at first. She was clearly a competent woman. She had managed her first household after her first husband died with efficiency and without complaint. She was pleasant to the domestic staff in a way that showed she was aware of social distinctions but without any contempt. She had that look of someone who learned early that survival meant paying very close attention to other people's needs and figuring out how to meet them before you even got asked. She was, in short, exactly the kind of woman Harriet understood. They didn't become friends exactly. The social setup at Westmere didn't allow for that kind of direct relationship between a midwife and the wife of the younger son. But over the years, there was this quality of mutual recognition between them. They understood each other without having to say it, as women who had navigated difficult situations by being useful, by being careful, and by being underestimated. Vivian had one child with Thomas, a boy they named Robert, in the spring of 1852. Harriet attended that birth and wrote the entry in her notebook with the same thoroughness she applied to everything. Mother, child, physical details, father, Thomas Langford, husband. She didn't hesitate over that entry at all. There was nothing in what she had observed to complicate it. But she did note in a brief personal aside, something she rarely allowed herself in these records, that Vivian Langford's physical condition at the time suggested the pregnancy had been a difficult one. Not medically, but in some interior sense that Harriet had learned to recognize without being able to name it precisely. The kind of difficulty that doesn't come from the body resisting, but from something the woman was carrying that wasn't the child. She filed that observation in the back of her mind where it sat alongside 100 other half-formed impressions, and then she just continued with her work. In 1853, Edmund Langford Sr. died. He had been failing for almost 2 years, his heart just weakening bit by bit, and his death that March was quiet and expected. He was 69 years old. They buried him in the family plot at the edge of the Westmere property under a stone that listed his dates and his name and nothing else, which was the custom back then for men of his standing who wanted to be remembered for what they had built rather than who they actually were. Harriet attended the funeral from a distance, standing with the household staff near the back of the group, which was the appropriate place for her position. She watched Charles Langford at the graveside, composed, formal, accepting condolences with that same measured quality he brought to everything. She watched Thomas, who was distressed in a very visible, uncomfortable way that embarrassed everyone around him. She watched Ellen Langford hold her husband's arm with a grip that communicated way more than just wifely support. She watched all of it and said nothing, and that evening she went back to her room and made a brief note in her current notebook. March 14, 1853. E. Langford, Sr., deceased. 69 years. Funeral attended. Estate passed to Charles, eldest son, as per general expectation. No complication observed in proceedings. She paused. Then she added in her small, precise handwriting. The household will change now. That was an understatement. But Harriet never went in for dramatic predictions. She just recorded what she could see and left the interpretation to the future. The years between Edmund Sr.'s death and the accelerating national crisis of the late 1850s were the years when Westmere went through that subtle but completely irreversible change that happens to big households when the original source of their authority gets removed. The habits of deference that had organized the whole estate around Edmund's will and judgment were replaced slowly, and not without some friction, by the new hierarchies that Charles Langford was busy building. Charles was a capable man. He managed the property with real competence, maintained all the social connections the family needed to keep their standing in the county, and made financial decisions that, if not brilliant, were at least steady. He expanded the tobacco production, which was profitable back then, and invested cautiously in the kind of small improvements, better equipment, smarter crop rotation, that a man with his temperament found satisfying. What he could not control was his brother. Thomas Langford, in the years after their father died, turned into a source of increasing anxiety for the whole Westmere household. His drinking got worse. His business ventures, which were funded by the modest allowance Charles managed from the estate, failed with clockwork regularity. He would be absent from Westmere for long stretches, sometimes without any explanation, and when he came back he carried this air of resentment that just seemed to grow instead of fading with time. That resentment had a very specific shape, even though its exact details weren't immediately obvious to everyone who witnessed it. Thomas had gotten a smaller share of the estate than Charles. That was standard practice for eldest sons, and Edmund Sr. hadn't made any special arrangements to change it. And somewhere along the way, Thomas had convinced himself that this wasn't just tradition, it was an injustice. And that Charles wasn't just the beneficiary of convention, but the actual architect of his deprivation. Whether that resentment was justified or not is the kind of question only people inside a family can really answer, and people inside families hardly ever answer honestly. What Harriet could observe from where she stood was just the effect. A man who had always been restless turning increasingly bitter, and a brother who had always been measured turning increasingly watchful in the way that careful people get when they sense something moving toward them that they can't quite identify yet. Vivian Langford watched all of it with that expression Harriet had catalogued years before, composed, attentive, quietly calculating. In 1857, something happened that Harriet recorded with unusual care. She got called in late August to this small property on the edge of Albemarle County, a tenant farm that had no official connection to Westmere, but Harriet had been there before for other births. The woman in labor was named Margaret Dyer. She was maybe 25, unmarried according to the county records, and had been living at the tenant farm for about a year. The birth was uncomplicated. The baby was a boy, healthy. Harriet wrote the entry, and then she wrote the father's name. Not because Margaret volunteered it, but because Harriet, in that methodical way she had developed over 15 years of attending births all over the county, noticed, because she always noticed, the physical qualities of the child. The things a woman trained to observe and record simply could not ignore. She asked quietly and without any judgment, just like she always asked. Margaret Dyer told her. The father was Thomas Langford. Harriet wrote it in the notebook and closed the cover and walked the 3 miles back to Westmere in the early morning light, carrying her bag and the weight of what she now knew. And she did not change her expression or her manner by even a single degree when she arrived at the kitchen door and started her morning routine. She filed that entry in the box with all the others and just kept on watching. 2 years later, in the early spring of 1859, Vivian Langford showed up at Harriet's room late in the evening, way later than anyone would normally visit, and with a manner that was carefully casual in a way that communicated the exact opposite of casual to anyone paying real attention. She asked Harriet, in that oblique way people use when they need to ask something they can't ask directly, whether Harriet had ever attended to a woman named Margaret Dyer. Harriet said that she attended to a great many women all over the county and that she considered all her records completely confidential. Vivian nodded slowly. She thanked Harriet for her time and then left. She hadn't gotten a direct answer exactly, but she had received, Harriet sensed, enough of a confirmation to help her figure out her next steps. Whatever those steps were going to be. Harriet didn't know back then what Vivian intended to do. She just filed that visit in the back of her mind alongside all the other observations she had accumulated and didn't yet fully understand, and she went to sleep, and in the morning she kept on with her work. To really understand what Vivian Langford was doing during those years, you have to understand what her position in the Westmere household had become. After 7 years of marriage to Thomas, she wasn't technically poor. Thomas's allowance from the estate, while smaller than what Charles controlled, was enough for a modest life. Their son Robert was healthy and growing. She had a place at the Langford table during dinners, and at the church in Charlottesville, and at all those county gatherings where the substantial families of Albemarle displayed themselves to each other in the social rituals that governed who belonged where. But her position was, like all positions that depend on a single unsteady man, precarious. Thomas's absences kept getting longer. His debts kept getting harder to hide. And Vivian, who was not the type of woman to let herself be surprised when she could avoid it, had long since started building the kind of private knowledge that serves as ballast against an uncertain future. She knew, for example, about Margaret Dyer. Not from Harriet. She hadn't confirmed anything directly from Harriet. But she was the type of woman who noticed things, and she had noticed the timing of Thomas's disappearances, and she had heard through that network of information that women in those communities maintained with such careful discretion about a young woman on a tenant farm who had a child that people who knew the Langford family sometimes looked at twice. She had asked Harriet not for confirmation of the fact. She was already pretty sure about that. She wanted something more specific. She wanted to know if Harriet had a written record. She wanted to know if that information existed anywhere in a form that could actually be used. Harriet had neither confirmed nor denied the existence of any such record. But Vivian was perceptive, and she knew exactly what that careful non-answer from a professional woman really meant. She didn't approach Harriet again for almost 2 years, but she quietly started cultivating the kind of relationship with Harriet that a woman in her position could maintain without drawing any attention. Small acknowledgments of Harriet's presence. Occasional little gifts of the domestic type that women exchanged across social differences. A habit of thanking Harriet in a way that went just slightly beyond the formal minimum. Harriet accepted all of it with her usual composed politeness and just kept on keeping her own counsel. Meanwhile, the political situation in Virginia and all across the southern states was deteriorating in ways that made all these private family anxieties feel both more urgent and somehow less important at the same time. The debates over slavery and secession that had been building for a decade were really accelerating. And men like Charles Langford, who had built their entire lives and fortunes on the labor of enslaved people, but who weren't really ideologues at heart, found themselves under increasing pressure to pick a side in a conflict that neither side had asked their permission to start. Charles chose Virginia. He couldn't have done anything else without losing everything he had built. But he chose Virginia with the grim practicality of a man who understands exactly what the choice is going to cost and has already calculated whether he can afford it. Thomas, predictably, was way more volatile. He got enthusiastic about secession in the same way he got enthusiastic about everything, brightly and briefly, and then he got anxious, and then he got resentful that Charles was managing the family's public position without consulting him, and then he disappeared to Charlottesville for 6 weeks and came back looking like he had aged 5 years. Vivian watched all of this without any comment at all. And then, in the spring of 1860, a full year before the war actually started, something happened that none of them had planned for. Thomas came to Harriet's room. It wasn't unusual for members of the household to come to Harriet with small medical concerns. A winter cough, a persistent headache, the kind of minor thing you prefer to deal with before it turns into something serious. Thomas had done that occasionally over the years, though less often than other members of the household, because he had this slightly unusual quality of never quite looking directly at Harriet, like there was some specific discomfort in her presence that he managed by just not fully acknowledging she was there. This visit was different. He sat down in the single chair across from where Harriet stood at her workbench, and he was quiet for a moment longer than any ordinary small-talk preamble would require, and then he asked her something directly. He asked her if she kept records of the births she attended. Harriet said yes, she kept notes, like any professional would, for the purpose of her own medical reference. He asked if those notes were detailed. She said they contained whatever was medically relevant. He asked if she had ever recorded the names of fathers. She looked at him for a moment, not long, just long enough to let him understand that she had understood the question, and then she said calmly that her records were confidential, and that she considered the details of her professional observations to be private matters of trust between herself and the women she attended. He sat with that answer for a moment. Then he stood up, looked at her in a voice that was not quite steady, and left. He never asked again. But the very next morning, Harriet moved the tin-lined box from under her bed to a completely different location, one she didn't record anywhere because she was careful, and she started for the first time to really think about what would happen to those notebooks when she eventually died. She was 59 years old. She was in good health, but she wasn't the type of woman to deceive herself about how time works. She had 27 years of careful record-keeping in those boxes. She had the truth about so many births, including births that the powerful people all around her would have very strongly preferred were not documented anywhere at all. She thought about burning the notebooks. She thought about it seriously for several weeks, and then she decided not to. She wasn't entirely sure back then why she made that decision. She told herself it was professional principle. The same principle that made Agnes insist on keeping records. The same principle that made any serious practitioner maintain documentation of their work. It wasn't wrong to keep records. It had never been wrong. The wrongness was in the events she had recorded, not in the record-keeping itself. But there was something else too, something she acknowledged to herself with more difficulty. She had watched for almost 20 years what happened when the truth about certain things was just allowed to vanish completely. When the births she had attended were treated like they had never even happened. When the children she had helped bring into the world got filed in estate inventories or buried in county records under names that erased their actual origins. When the women who had told her things in the difficult intimacy of labor were left to carry those secrets all alone without even the small dignity of having the truth written down somewhere. She would not burn the notebooks. She would find a way to make sure they survived. The war remade absolutely everything. This isn't really a story about the war though. The story was already moving toward its destination before that first shot was even fired at Fort Sumter. But the war was the landscape that the remaining acts played out against, and its weight changed the texture of every single decision that followed. Westmere didn't suffer the kind of physical devastation that some Virginia properties experienced. It didn't get burned, it wasn't occupied for long periods, it wasn't stripped of livestock and supplies in that systematic way that happened to plantations farther south. Charles Langford had managed his relationships with the military authorities on both sides with that same cold competence he brought to everything. And while the estate lost workers and horses and part of the harvest each year during the war, its basic structure stayed intact. What really changed at Westmere was the people. The enslaved workers, during those chaotic war years and then during the formal disruption of emancipation, left in waves. Some left early when Union forces started moving through the region. Some left in the months right after the proclamation. Some didn't leave until the very end, when the legal framework finally confirmed what the war's momentum had already established. Their departure left Westmere understaffed, its acreage shrinking with every season, its financial position deteriorating the way all large agricultural enterprises built on labor that had just been made illegal tend to deteriorate. Charles responded to this with that grim methodical adaptation that was so characteristic of him. He reduced the amount of land they cultivated, hired whatever free labor he could afford at the wages the market was starting to set, and began that long, quiet calculation of what could be sold, what could be leased, and what just had to be abandoned. Thomas did not adapt. Thomas drank and quarreled with Charles and made plans that never went anywhere, and in 1863 he caught a fever that the doctor said was typhoid and spent 6 weeks hovering in that borderland between life and death before coming back to a version of himself that was diminished in ways that were never entirely clear. Whether from the illness itself, or from the war, or from the accumulation of all those years that had brought him to this point, nobody could really say. Vivian nursed him through that fever. She did it with the same composed efficiency she brought to everything. When he recovered, she received his gratitude with polite acknowledgement and just kept on watching. Harriet was present through all of it. She was in her early 60s by then, older than most women in her profession who were still practicing, but her health was still good and her skills were still sharp. And in the disrupted world of wartime Westmere, where the normal supply of medical care had been further reduced by all the young physicians leaving for military service, her presence was more valuable than ever. She delivered 5 babies at Westmere during the war years. One was to a hired laborer's wife who had come to the property as part of Charles's post-emancipation workforce. The other 4 were to women who had been enslaved at Westmere and who, during the transition, occupied this complicated in-between status that the formal legal categories of freedom and slavery couldn't quite describe. She recorded all 5 in her notebooks. She recorded them with the same thoroughness she had always applied. And for 2 of those entries, she recorded again the names of fathers, information provided the same way it always was, quietly and in confidence during those hours of labor when all the normal social barriers just temporarily dissolved. The names were not names she had expected to write. One of them was a name she had written before. She closed the notebook that evening and sat for a very long time in her room, staring at nothing, before she put it back in the box. Before we go any further with this, if you've made it this far into the story, you already know this isn't the kind of history they ever teach in any classroom. If you want to make sure you never miss one of these stories, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. The next one is already waiting for you. So, 1865 to 1869. Robert Langford was 13 years old when the war ended. He was Thomas and Vivian's son. That child born in 1852 whose entry in Harriet's notebook was just that single uncomplicated line. He was also, by the time he reached his teens, the most promising young man in the Langford family in a whole generation, which was both a compliment and a huge burden to carry. He had his mother's quality of attention, which was considerable, and his father's physical appearance, which was striking. Tall, dark-haired, with that particular kind of presence that just draws other people's eyes in a room without the person having to make any effort at all. He was also serious in a way that Thomas had never been, with a genuine intelligence that the plantation school hadn't quite known how to handle, and that Vivian had supplemented as best she could with books and occasional tutoring that wartime Virginia made possible. Charles Langford, who had no sons of his own, only daughters, after that little boy Edmund Holt died of fever at age 4 back in 1851, had been watching his nephew with interest for several years, and had quietly started thinking of Robert as a potential heir. Not in the strict legal sense. The estate was entangled in ways that would require significant legal work to alter. But in the practical sense, the sense where an aging man with no male heir starts looking toward the next generation and calculating who can be trusted with everything he has built. This calculation was not invisible to the people around Charles. Vivian noticed it. She noticed it with that careful, neutral expression of a woman who has learned not to let her face show her thoughts too clearly, because her thoughts were complicated. She had never been entirely sure how she felt about Robert. She loved him, of course, the uncomplicated physical love of a mother for the child she had carried and delivered and raised. But she was also a woman who knew things, and the things she knew cast a shadow over certain simple feelings, which she managed by not examining them too closely. She had never spoken to Robert about what she knew. She had never spoken to anyone about it, not directly, not in words that could be repeated. The only person in the world who had any piece of the information she carried was Harriet Voss, who had the professional discretion of a confessor and the personal self-containment of a woman who had long since learned that what you know and what you say are two completely separate decisions. In 1867, Robert Langford went to Richmond to study law. This was Charles's idea, and Charles funded it, arranging a place with a law firm there and paying for the lodgings and expenses with a generosity that showed just how serious his intentions were regarding his nephew's future. Robert was 16. He was young for such a step, but the war had compressed the normal timelines of education and professional entry for a whole generation of Southern young men. And Robert, serious, disciplined, genuinely capable, was better prepared than most. Before he left, he came to say goodbye to Harriet. That surprised her. He had always been polite to her over the years, the way children of the household are polite to domestic staff who have been there their whole lives, a courtesy that comes more from habit than from any particular thought. But this goodbye was different. He sat down in the chair across from her workbench, the same chair his father had sat in 7 years earlier asking about her records, and he looked at her directly with those dark eyes that had always struck Harriet as carrying more weight than a boy his age should have to carry. He said he wanted to ask her something. She said he could ask. He said he had heard over the years that she kept records of the births she attended. He said he didn't mean to pry and he didn't want to know any specifics. He just wanted to know if it was true. She said yes, it was true. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think you've seen things in this house that nobody else would have written down. I think that matters. I don't know exactly why I'm telling you this, but I wanted you to know that I'm grateful you're careful." Harriet looked at him for a long moment. She said carefully that she had always tried to do her work with integrity and that she was glad if it had been of service to anyone. He nodded and stood up and shook her hand, which no young man of his position had ever done with Harriet before, and then he left. She sat there for a long time after he was gone. Then she took out her current notebook and wrote a brief entry, not about a birth this time, but a note to herself, the only one of its kind she ever wrote. Robert left today for Richmond. He is careful. He is watching. He is Vivian's son. She paused. She added, "He may be the only one I can trust." Then she closed the notebook and put it away. 1869 to 1871. Charles Langford died in the autumn of 1869. A heart condition that had announced itself gradually and was managed as it became urgent by the simple application of rest and the gradual reduction of all the work that had defined his life for 30 years. He was 56. He died the way he had lived, methodically, without any fuss, having arranged all his affairs with characteristic thoroughness in the months before the end. His will was read in December of 1869 in the parlor at Westmere by the family attorney, a man named Willis Kramer, who had served the Langford family for 15 years. He read the document with that neutral, professional expression of a man who has delivered both welcome and unwelcome news to enough people that he has learned to calibrate his face accordingly. The substance of the will was straightforward in its broad outline, but complicated in its specifics. The estate, what remained of it, which was considerably less than the 4,000 acres of the antebellum years, the war and its aftermath had required sales and contractions that reduced Westmere to something under 1,800 acres, was left in its entirety to Thomas Langford's son, Robert, on the condition that Robert completed his legal education and returned to Albemarle County to manage the property and its associated interests within 3 years of Charles's death. The bequest to Charles's own daughters, Catherine and a younger daughter named Margaret born in 1854, was substantial in terms of monetary value, but did not include the land, which was the specific thing that defined the Langford identity in the county's social structure. Thomas received nothing beyond what he had already been receiving from the estate allowance, a provision that acknowledged without explicit statement what Charles had assessed about his brother's capacity to steward anything of lasting value. Thomas's reaction to this reading was not exactly explosive. He was too worn down by the years, too diminished by the illness and the drinking and the long erosion of his own personality to produce the kind of dramatic outburst the situation might have called for in an earlier, stronger man. He was instead very still and very pale, and the quality of his stillness communicated something that Harriet, observing from the doorway of the adjacent room where she had been asked to wait in case Mrs. Langford needed anything, recognized as that specific kind of rage that has nowhere left to go. He left the parlor without speaking. That night, Vivian came to Harriet's room again. She sat down in the chair and was quiet for a moment. Then she told Harriet that she needed to speak to her about something that had been a long time coming. Harriet waited. Vivian said that she was going to ask Harriet something that she had no right to ask, that she knew she had no right to ask, and that she was asking anyway because the situation had reached a point where the information Harriet carried was the only thing that might protect Robert. Harriet said, "Protect Robert from what?" Vivian said, "From Thomas." She didn't explain any further and she didn't need to. Harriet had been watching the Langford family for 27 years, and she hadn't spent those years being inattentive. She understood what Vivian meant by protect. She understood what a man like Thomas, cornered by circumstance and inheritance and the final confirmation of his own inadequacy, might do if he found a way to challenge that will, to question its basis, to find some legal thread to pull that might unravel everything his brother had arranged. She also understood what Vivian was really asking her for. She was asking for the notebooks. Not all of them. Not the whole 27 years of births and fathers and careful notations. But certain specific entries. Entries that would establish certain facts about certain people which, in the hands of a young attorney who happened to be the named heir and who happened to be Robert Langford, might constitute the kind of incontrovertible documentation that makes a legal challenge very, very difficult. Harriet was quiet for a very long time. Then she asked Vivian something she had never asked anyone directly. She asked, "Why does it matter? What is Thomas going to find if he looks?" Vivian looked at her with that steady expression of a woman who had been carrying a stone for 18 years. She said, "You know what he'll find. You recorded it. You've had it in that box for 18 years. Silence. Robert, he has to be protected." Harriet looked at the wall. Then she asked very quietly whether Robert knew. Vivian said no, Robert did not know, and she did not want him to know if it could possibly be avoided. She wanted the threat neutralized without the truth ever having to be spoken. She wanted the notebooks to serve as a deterrent, to be the thing that existed, that people who needed to know about knew about, that prevented the wrong questions from being asked rather than answering them. Harriet said she would think about it. Vivian left. Harriet did not sleep that night. She lay on her narrow bed in the dark and thought about the question of what the notebooks were actually for. She had told herself back in 1860 that she was keeping them because burning them was wrong, because the truth of those entries had a right to exist somewhere regardless of whether anyone ever read them. She had told herself it was professional principle. But Vivian was asking her to use them, not to reveal them necessarily, but to use the fact of their existence, the threat of their potential revelation, to manage a situation where a powerful man might otherwise succeed in taking something from someone who, in Harriet's private assessment, had a stronger claim to it than he did. She thought about that. She thought about the entry she had written in 1852, that uncomplicated one. Mother Vivian Langford, child, male, father Thomas Langford, husband. And she thought about the entry she had written in 1857 at the tenant farm. And she thought about the entry she had written in 1863 at Westmere during the war, which she had only reread twice in all the years since, and which sat in that box like a stone. She thought about Robert and his direct eyes and the handshake that no young man of his position had ever given her before. She thought about what it meant to keep a record and what it meant to actually use one. By morning, she had made a decision. December 1869 to January 1870. Harriet did not give the notebooks to Vivian. That wasn't what she decided, and it wasn't what Vivian had asked for. What she decided was something more precise. She took the relevant entries, not the originals, but copies she made herself over several nights by the light of her small lamp in that careful handwriting that had never in 30 years of practice become uncertain. And she placed those copies in a sealed envelope, and she gave that envelope to a man she trusted with a very specific and very clear instruction. The man was a freedman named George Rives, who had formerly been enslaved at Westmere, who had left in 1864 and settled in Charlottesville, and who had been known to Harriet for years as a man of particular reliability. She had attended the births of 2 of his children. He regarded her with that quiet respect people reserve for those who have been present at the most fundamental moments of their lives. She told him, "This envelope is to be delivered to Robert Langford in Richmond within the week. Not through the ordinary post. By hand. By a trustworthy carrier." She told him it was important. He didn't ask what was inside. He took the envelope and left. She then wrote a letter to Robert, brief, formal, the kind of letter a woman in her position could write to a man in his without attracting any comment, which said only that she hoped he was well, that his mother was well, and that he might receive a communication from a trusted source that she hoped he would treat with the utmost discretion. It said nothing else. She sent that letter by post. Then she waited. 3 weeks later, she received a note from Robert. Also brief, also careful, that said only, "I have received what was sent. I understand its significance. Please be assured that I will handle it appropriately. And thank you, Miss Harriet." She burned the note, and she put the original notebooks back in their box in their new location, and continued with her work. What actually happened in Richmond during those weeks, she never knew in detail. She inferred it later from the sequence of events, the way you infer the course of a hidden stream from the pattern of the trees growing above it. Thomas Langford, who had been quietly consulting with a different attorney about the grounds for challenging his brother's will, withdrew those consultations in February of 1870. The withdrawal was total and final, accomplished without any public statement or explanation. Thomas returned to his rooms in the outbuilding at Westmere and continued to drink and to diminish and to avoid as much as possible his son, who came back from Richmond in the spring of 1870 having completed his legal education at the accelerated pace that necessity demanded. Robert Langford, 21 years old, took possession of Westmere in the spring of 1870. He assumed management of what remained of the estate with the same careful gravity that Charles had shown in his best years, and he started the long process of stabilizing the property's finances and its position in the county. He did not speak to Harriet about what had been in that envelope. She did not speak to him about it. But when he arrived at Westmere and came to her room on his very first evening there, again, that direct quality of attention that set him apart from everyone else in that household, he looked at her and said, "You've kept this family honest when it couldn't keep itself honest. I don't know how to repay that." She said, "You don't have to. Just manage the estate well." He said he would try. She believed him. There's more to this story, and where it goes next is probably not what you're expecting. Before we go on, take a second to share this with someone who loves history that cuts this deep. These stories survive because of listeners like you. So, 1870 to 1872. Thomas Langford did not accept his situation quietly. That wasn't in his nature, and the years and the illness and the drinking hadn't changed his nature so much as they had stripped away the outer layers of self-control that had previously, imperfectly, contained it. What he did wasn't dramatic. There was no confrontation, no public accusation, no moment of theatrical revelation. What he did was the thing that small, diminished men do when they've been maneuvered into a corner and lack the resources for a direct assault. He talked. He talked to people in Charlottesville. He talked to men at the tavern and at the county courthouse in that careful, elliptical way people talk when they want to float an accusation without actually owning its consequences. He implied things. He suggested that the will's disposition was irregular. He hinted, never stated, always hinted that there were circumstances around Robert's birth, around the question of who exactly Robert's father had been, that might change certain assessments if they were ever properly examined. This was dangerous talk. It was the kind of talk that, in the Virginia of that immediate post-war period, operated in a minefield of competing anxieties about race, about inheritance, about the newly complicated legal landscape of a state that was technically under Reconstruction governance and hadn't yet fully resolved what any of that meant for the social arrangements that had defined it for 2 centuries. What Thomas was implying in that delicate language of implication was this, that Robert's father might not have been Thomas Langford, that the question of Robert's parentage was not as settled as it appeared, that if one were to look carefully at the circumstances of his birth, one might find things. He wasn't wrong that there were things to find. He was wrong about what they actually were. This distinction between what Thomas thought was in Harriet's notebooks and what was actually in them is the central irony of this whole story. And it's the kind of irony that only becomes visible in retrospect. Thomas had spent years afraid of what Harriet knew. He had come to her room in 1860 and asked about her records precisely because he feared she had documentation of his relationship with Margaret Dyer and the child who had resulted from it. Documentation that Vivian might use, that a court might consider, that might create legal complications for his already precarious position. His fear had been all about his own secrets. But the entry in Harriet's notebook that Vivian had used to protect Robert, the entry that Robert had received in that sealed envelope in Richmond, was not about Thomas's secrets at all. It was about something else entirely. It was about a birth at Westmere in 1863 during the war, when the household had been stripped of its normal staff and the extraordinary pressures of wartime had altered the behavioral landscape in ways that all the peacetime social rules had previously kept suppressed. It was about who had come to Harriet's room on a particular night in late 1862 and asked her to keep something quiet, and it was about whose name she had written in her small, precise hand beside the entry for a birth that no one else had ever recorded. Thomas Langford did not know about that entry. He never had. His fear of Harriet's notebooks had been based on a correct general assessment of her thoroughness and an incorrect specific assessment of what she had actually written. What he was implying in Charlottesville was that Robert might be illegitimate in the sense that would have mattered most in Virginia's social order, that his blood might not be entirely what the Langford name required. He wasn't specific. He couldn't afford to be specific because specificity required evidence and he didn't have it. But the implication was enough to move through certain social circles with that quiet, persistent virulence of rumor. Robert heard about it. His reaction was not the one Thomas had anticipated. Instead of panic or denial, or the kind of furious reputation management that would have given the rumor more momentum, Robert was very still and very calm and very, very methodical. He contacted Willis Kramer, the family attorney, and had a series of meetings whose content was not recorded in any document that has survived. He contacted Harriet by letter, formal and careful, and asked whether she would be willing to confirm in writing the facts of certain births she had attended, if such confirmation were ever required for legal purposes. She wrote back, yes. He contacted the county courthouse and began a careful audit of the estate documents, the birth records, the family Bible entries, and every other piece of paper that had ever formally documented anything about the Langford family. What he found, or rather what he confirmed, because he had suspected it since that envelope arrived from Richmond, was that Thomas Langford's implied campaign was built on a specific misunderstanding. Robert's birth was exactly what the official record said it was. He was Thomas Langford's son, born in lawful marriage to Vivian Carr Langford, delivered by Harriet Voss at Westmere on April 19, 1852. The entry in Harriet's notebook was clear and completely unambiguous. What the notebook also contained, in an earlier entry, one that Thomas had never even imagined existed, was the fact of who had actually fathered the child born to Margaret Dyer in 1857. Not Thomas. Charles. Charles Langford, the careful, methodical, morally upright patriarch, had been at some point in 1856 or early 1857 involved with Margaret Dyer in the way that Harriet had documented. Charles, whose will had bequeathed everything to Robert. Charles, whose reputation was the very foundation on which Thomas's entire implied campaign was built, that implicit contrast between the legitimate heir's grandfather and whatever irregularities Thomas was suggesting. If that entry in Harriet's notebook ever became public, it would not destroy Robert. Robert's birth was unimpeachably documented. It would destroy Charles's legacy. And with Charles's legacy destroyed, the whole moral framework that Thomas was using, the suggestion that the respectable side of the family was setting up their son to claim what was rightfully Thomas's, would just collapse. Thomas had been threatening to pull a thread, and the thread he was pulling was attached to his own family's credibility. Robert, who had read the copies of Harriet's entries and understood exactly what they contained, sat down and wrote his uncle a letter. The letter was brief. It didn't make any explicit accusations. It didn't quote from Harriet's notebooks. It simply observed, in the careful language of a trained legal mind, that a challenge to the will would require the introduction of certain evidence about the family's history, and that such evidence, once introduced into a legal proceeding, would be subject to examination that might prove illuminating in ways that no one in the family would welcome. He sent that letter by private messenger. Thomas received it, read it, and did not reply. He also stopped talking. 1872 to 1875. The silence that followed Thomas's withdrawal was not the silence of resolution. It was the silence of a family that had looked at the full extent of what it contained, and had made a collective, unspoken agreement to just look away. The Langford family was not unique in this. Most families of their standing and their history were built on layers of suppression, on the understanding that the past had to be managed, that memory was a resource to be curated rather than a record to be consulted. They had learned the skill over generations, and they applied it now with the efficiency of long practice. Thomas died in the spring of 1874. He was 52. His death was attributed to the cumulative effects of the typhoid illness he had survived in 1863 and the years of drinking that had followed. He was buried in the Langford family plot at a distance from Edmund Sr.'s stone, and the family gathered at the graveside with that solemn, private expression people wear when they are burying something more complicated than just grief. Vivian outlived him by many years. She stayed at Westmere in the rooms that had been hers since her marriage and occupied a position in the household that was slightly undefined in the formal sense. She was Robert's mother, but she was not the mistress of the estate, which was increasingly managed by Robert, and after 1873 by Robert's wife, a woman named Helen Slade, who had been educated in Richmond, and who brought to Westmere a quality of brisk, clear-eyed competence that Charles Langford would have recognized as his own. The notebooks stayed in Harriet's box. She hadn't used them, not in any direct sense. She had made copies of specific entries and sent those copies to Richmond. The originals remained in her possession in that tin-lined box in the location she had moved them to in 1869 and which she had never told anyone about. She was in 1874, 73 years old, and still practicing. Less actively than in her peak years, but still available when called, still maintaining the routines of her professional life with the stubbornness of a woman who has defined herself for so long by what she does that the alternative feels like a kind of surrender. She had attended, by her own rough count, somewhere between 400 and 450 births over the course of her practice. She had recorded all of them. The notebooks in that tin-lined box, 5 of them now, contained the documentation of 40 years of births across Albemarle County and the surrounding area, in all their variety and complication and ordinary human truth. She thought sometimes about what would happen to them when she died. She didn't have any close relatives. She had no children. She had colleagues, other women who practiced in the county, younger than she was, who had learned from her the same way she had learned from Agnes. But she didn't feel that passing the notebooks to any of them was appropriate. The notebooks weren't just professional documents in the ordinary sense. They were something more specific and more weighted than that. She had Robert. She trusted Robert. But she wasn't certain that giving the notebooks to Robert was right either, because Robert had a direct interest in their contents. And a person with a direct interest in a document is not the ideal custodian of that document. She thought about this problem in the slow, patient way she had always thought about difficult problems for the last 3 years of her life. She did not fully resolve it. 1875 to 1877. In the spring of 1875, Harriet Voss began writing something that was neither a birth record nor a professional note. She wrote it in a new book, not a ledger, but a small journal of the kind that women sometimes kept for private correspondence or reflection, purchased from the dry goods store in Charlottesville on one of her infrequent trips into town. She wrote over the course of several months what might be described as an account. Not a confession, she had done nothing she needed to confess. Not a memoir, she had no interest in that genre. What she wrote was a careful, comprehensive description of the notebooks, what they contained, how they were organized, what the most significant entries documented, and where the originals were actually stored. She wrote it in a voice that was almost entirely free of interpretation or editorial comment. The same voice she used in the notebooks themselves. Here are the facts. Here is what I recorded. Here is where it is. She did not name in this account the person or persons she intended to receive it. She left that blank with a note to herself in the margin to be determined. Over the following year, she wrote 3 letters. One was to Robert Langford. One was to a woman named Frances Hardy, a Quaker reformer based in Philadelphia who had corresponded with Harriet over the years, primarily on matters of midwifery practice, and who had a quality of moral seriousness that Harriet respected. The third was to the county courthouse in Charlottesville, specifically to the office of the county clerk, to the incumbent and his successors, with a request that it be preserved in the official files. Each letter contained different information. None of them contained everything. The letter to Robert acknowledged the history between them and described in general terms the existence of the notebooks and the nature of their contents. It said that the originals would be left in the care of a specified person whose name she would communicate to him separately. It asked him to trust her judgment about how the information was managed and expressed her confidence that he would. The letter to Frances Hardy described the midwifery records in the context of a broader argument about the importance of documentation, about the way that the lives of women, and particularly the lives of women in certain positions, were systematically absent from the official historical record, and about the way that private record-keeping by practitioners like Harriet represented an essential counter-archive. She described the notebooks as historical documents of genuine significance and asked Frances to ensure, if anything happened to her, that they were preserved in a form that historians and legal scholars might someday access. The letter to the county clerk was the most remarkable of the 3. It was a formal statement written in the legal register that years of exposure to the work of men like Willis Cramer and Robert Langford had given her, attesting to the accuracy and completeness of her records, to the methodology she had used in keeping them, and to the specific categories of information they contained. She did not file it immediately. She kept it in the journal alongside the account she had written. She knew, building something. A structure. The kind of structure that could survive her, that could make the notebooks useful after she was gone without requiring anyone to act improperly or anyone to violate the confidences that she had maintained for 40 years. She was, in her methodical and unhurried way, constructing the conditions for a truth to survive. October 1877. Harriet Voss died on the 14th of October 1877. She was 76 years old. The cause of her death was a stroke, quick in the end, the kind of death that practical women who have spent decades watching others struggle through more prolonged endings often seem to arrange for themselves, as though the body, trained to efficiency by long years of use, extends that efficiency to its own departure. She had been at Westmere until the end, or not quite at Westmere, but in the small house that Robert had arranged for her in the mid-1870s, when it became clear that her health required more comfort than that room off the kitchen had ever provided. It was a modest house on a half-acre at the edge of the property, with a proper bedroom and a sitting room and a kitchen, and it was the first space that had ever been entirely hers. She had organized it in the last years of her life with characteristic thoroughness. Her medical supplies were inventoried and labeled. Her correspondence files were organized chronologically. Her professional library, modest but carefully curated, was listed on a paper inside the front cover of the first book. And the tin-lined box, which had traveled with her from that room off the kitchen to her new house, was exactly where it needed to be. She had communicated its location in a sealed letter given to Robert with instructions that it be opened only after her death, with complete specificity. She had left the journal, the one containing the account of the notebook's contents and her 3 unsent letters, in the box with the notebooks themselves. Robert opened the sealed letter the day after her death. He found the box. He found the journal. He sat with it for a very long time in the sitting room of that small house that still held the atmosphere of a person recently removed from it. And he read what she had written. He read about Margaret Dyer. He read the 1857 entry which told him something about his own uncle and father that was simultaneously unsurprising and newly painful in its documentation. He read the 1863 entry, the one he had already known about from the copies sent to Richmond. Reading the original was different. The original was in Harriet's hand, with that particular quality of her handwriting, small, precise, unhurried, and it made the fact more real in a way he hadn't anticipated. He read for the first time the entry about Nora in November of 1841. He read the initials E.L. He thought about his grandfather, the stone in the family plot, the men who had organized this entire world that Robert was now responsible for. He sat for a long time. Then he did what Harriet had, in her indirect way, asked him to do. He sent the letter to Frances Hardy. Not just forwarded it, he enclosed his own note attesting to Harriet's reliability and the historical significance of the records and asking Frances to act as she saw fit in ensuring their preservation. He sent the letter to the county courthouse, again with his own accompanying note, identifying himself as the executor of Harriet's estate and attesting to the document's legal validity. He kept the originals in their box in a locked cabinet in the estate's office at Westmere, and he left them there. He did not tell his mother what was in the box. He didn't need to. Vivian Langford was 63 years old and had spent 31 years managing the knowledge she carried, and she did not need anyone to describe its weight to her. He did not tell his wife. Not yet. He wasn't certain in those early weeks after Harriet's death what exactly was going to happen. He only knew that something had shifted, that the notebook's existence, which had for 20 years been a private deterrent operating in the background of the family's life, had now become something more formal, more legible, more available to the world outside the Langford family's private calculations. He was right that something was going to happen. He simply did not know how exactly or when. Frances Hardy was a woman who understood the significance of documentation in a way that was characteristic of her community and her era. The Quaker abolitionist tradition had for decades before emancipation built its moral arguments on the careful accumulation of testimony, records, and evidence. The argument against slavery had always been, in part, a paper argument. These are the facts written down by witnesses available for examination. When Harriet's letter arrived in Philadelphia, Frances read it with the focused attention of a woman who has been waiting for a specific kind of confirmation for a very long time. She had known from years of correspondence with Harriet that the Albemarle County midwife kept unusual records. She had suspected that those records contained information of historical and potentially legal significance. She had not known the full extent of what Harriet had documented. Reading that letter, she understood. She began in the spring of 1878 a quiet and methodical effort to bring Harriet's records to the attention of people who could assess their significance. She was careful. She was not trying to create a scandal or destroy a family. She was genuinely, philosophically convinced that the kind of historical record Harriet had created deserved to exist in the formal archive where historians and legal scholars could access it. She communicated with a network of colleagues, reform advocates, historians, the nascent organizations that were beginning to think about the documentation of African American history in the post-war South. And she described in carefully general terms what she knew about the notebooks. The response was slow, as these things always are, but it was real. In 1880, a historian named A.R. Beaumont, who was connected to a university in Philadelphia and who had been corresponding with Frances about the documentation of Southern birth practices, made a trip to Albemarle County. He met with Robert Langford, presented his credentials, and made a formal request to examine the notebooks. Robert agreed. He did so with the same careful gravity he brought to every significant decision and with an awareness that this moment, this agreement, was in some sense the thing that Harriet had been building toward for 40 years. Not scandal, documentation. The formal acknowledgement by the institutions that kept history that the things she had recorded deserved to be preserved alongside all the other things that had been preserved. Beaumont spent 4 days with the notebooks. He read every entry. He took extensive notes. What he published 2 years later was not a sensational account. It was a scholarly monograph, carefully argued, methodologically rigorous, the kind of document that was read by a small audience of historians and reformers and legal scholars who were thinking seriously about the documentation of the pre- and post-war South. But it named the notebooks. It described their contents. It quoted specific entries. It included the 1841 entry about Nora and the initials E.L. It included the 1857 entry about Margaret Dyer. It did not include the 1863 entry. Robert had made one redaction, one entry that he asked Beaumont to omit, and Beaumont had agreed on the understanding that the original was preserved in the county records and would be available for future scholars. The monograph circulated in that small world of serious historical inquiry. It was reviewed in 3 academic journals. One review was reprinted in a Philadelphia newspaper. The newspaper excerpt was reprinted in a Richmond paper. And from the Richmond paper, it reached Charlottesville. 1882 to 1883. The response in Albemarle County to the news that a dead midwife's notebooks had been published in a Philadelphia monograph was not uniform. There were people who dismissed it entirely. Old families closing ranks the way old families do, treating the documentation of their ancestors' behavior as an attack on their own dignity. There were people who engaged with it cautiously, acknowledging the historical significance while maintaining careful distance from the specific families involved. There were people who were genuinely disturbed. Not because the information was surprising exactly, but because the formal existence of a written record had a different quality than the unwritten knowledge that had circulated in the county for decades. The Langford name appeared in Beaumont's monograph twice. Once in the context of the 1841 birth, the notation about Edmund Langford, the grandfather, and the young enslaved woman named Nora, whose son had grown up at Westmere, and whose adult life had taken a path that Harriet's notebook, with its precise initials, now illuminated differently than the official family story suggested. Once in the context of the 1857 birth, the notation about Charles Langford and Margaret Dyer, whose son, by the time the monograph was published, was 24 years old and working on a farm in a neighboring county, entirely unaware that a scholarly document in Philadelphia had just identified his father. The children of Charles Langford, his daughters Catherine and Margaret, were both living at the time of publication. Catherine was married in Richmond with children of her own. Margaret was unmarried, still in Charlottesville. Both women received within weeks of the Richmond reprint letters from their family attorney and visits from concerned relatives who wanted to discuss how the family should respond. Catherine said in a letter to her attorney that has been preserved, "My father was a man of his time. I cannot pretend otherwise. I refuse to be ashamed of facts that are not my doing, but I will not pretend the facts are not the facts." Margaret did not write letters. She visited Westmere for the first time in several years and sat with Robert and Vivian in the parlor where 13 years earlier Willis Kramer had read Charles Langford's will. What was said in that room has not been recorded. But afterward, Margaret returned to Charlottesville and began quietly to make arrangements to meet the young man on the neighboring farm. His name was James Dyer. He was 24 years old, and he had his father's steady eyes and his mother's practical manner. And when Margaret Langford appeared at his door and introduced herself, he looked at her for a long moment and then said, "I wondered when someone would come." He had known. Not from any document, not from Beaumont's monograph, which had not yet reached him. He had known the way children in rural communities know things that adults have tried to keep from them, imperfectly, intuitively, through the accumulation of small inconsistencies and sidelong looks that eventually organize themselves into an understanding that resists formal articulation until formal articulation arrives. Margaret told him about the notebooks. She told him about Harriet Voss. She told him as precisely as she could what Harriet had written and what it meant for his understanding of his own family. He listened. He did not speak for a long time. Then he said, "She wrote it down because she thought it should exist." She was right. Margaret agreed. Vivian Langford died in February of 1884. She was 70 years old and she had outlived her husband by 10 years and her brother-in-law Charles by 15. She had outlived Harriet Voss, who had been in many ways the most important woman in her adult life, by 6 years. She had watched in those 6 years as Harriet's notebooks moved from the private deterrent they had been for 2 decades to the formally documented historical record they had become. She had watched the monograph's publication, the newspaper reprints, the family conversations that followed. She had watched Robert manage it all with the steadiness that she had spent 30 years quietly building in him, and she had allowed herself to feel something that she rarely permitted in full. The satisfaction of a plan carried through to its conclusion. Not her plan. She was careful about that distinction, even in her own private thoughts. Harriet's plan, or not even a plan exactly, a professional practice sustained with such consistency and integrity over so many years that it had become in the end something larger than any individual decision. Vivian had carried for 30 years knowledge that she had never shared directly with anyone except in the most oblique and implied ways. She had used that knowledge once in 1870 to protect her son from a threat that had been built on an ironic misunderstanding. She had lived with the rest of it, the full weight of what she knew, what it meant for the family she had married into and served and survived for 3 decades. In the last months of her life, when she was too ill to leave her rooms at Westmere, but still clear-minded and still watchful, she asked Robert to read to her from Beaumont's monograph. He did. He sat beside her bed and read the scholarly, careful, methodical account of a midwife's notebooks, and Vivian listened with her eyes closed and her hands still. When he finished the relevant sections, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, she was the only one who told the truth. Everyone else was managing something. Robert said nothing. She said, I was managing something, too. I know that. He said, you were protecting me. She said yes, but she wasn't protecting anyone. She was just writing things down. That's different. He agreed that it was different. She died 3 weeks later, quietly, in the same practical and undemonstrative way she had lived. The years following Vivian's death were the years in which the full consequences of Harriet's notebooks worked their way through the Langford family and through the wider community of Albemarle County in the slow, patient way that documented truths always do. Not in dramatic explosions, but in the gradual reorientation of what people knew and what they were willing to acknowledge knowing. The man who turned out to have the most sustained response to the notebook's publication was not a Langford. It was James Dyer, the son of Margaret Dyer and Charles Langford, who had said to Margaret Langford, in that direct, unadorned way that seemed characteristic of people who had spent their lives at the edge of powerful families rather than inside them, that Harriet was right to write it down. James Dyer became in the 1880s something of an informal historian of Albemarle County social history. Not a professional scholar, not an academic, but a man who had developed a specific and deeply motivated interest in the gap between official records and actual events. He corresponded with Beaumont. He corresponded with Frances Hardy before her death in 1886. He visited the county courthouse and examined the records that Harriet had identified in her formal letter to the clerk. He found in those records things that corroborated what the notebooks contained, and things that the notebooks alone would not have revealed, the way that formal records and private records together created a more complete picture than either alone. He began to understand in doing this work why Harriet had kept her notebooks. Not because she distrusted the official record, but because she understood that the official record had specific structural limitations. That it documented what the powerful wanted documented and left blank what the powerful wanted blank. And that someone who was present at the events themselves, present in the room, trusted by the people involved, writing in private without anyone's approval or direction, could fill in those blanks in a way that no official system ever could. In 1888, James Dyer published a short essay in a Philadelphia historical journal, a modest venue, but one with a serious readership among historians interested in Southern social history. The essay was about midwifery records as historical sources. It described in general terms the kind of information that a skilled and conscientious midwife like Harriet Voss could accumulate over a career. And it argued for the historical value of such records as a corrective to the structural silences of official documentation. He did not name names beyond what Beaumont had already published. He didn't need to. The argument stood on its own. The essay was read by fewer than 1,000 people, but it was read by the people who were thinking about these questions, and it contributed in the small, incremental way that all good arguments contribute to the growing understanding in historical scholarship that the archive was always incomplete, always curated by power, always in need of the supplementary record kept by those who were present, but never counted. In the Albemarle County Courthouse, the formal letter that Harriet had left with the clerk and that Robert had formally submitted after her death was eventually transferred in 1896 to the newly established State Archive in Richmond. The certificate of deposit recorded its origin. Harriet Voss, midwife, Albemarle County, record of professional practice 1837 to 1877. It was catalogued, given a reference number, and filed. No one looked at it for 20 years, but it was there. It existed. It was preserved. That was what she had done.